Hey everyone, this is Chris from Console Customs, and today I'm going to take you through the installation of our PS5 Smart Trigger LITE mod. Now our LITE mods come in two options, either the mouse click, which is this one here, has a nice tactile click like a computer mouse button, or our silent tact version, which doesn't make any noise at all. These mods replace only the triggers R2 and L2, as opposed to our Smart Trigger Pro version here, which will replace both triggers and bumpers. The great thing about the LITE version is the installation doesn't require tearing down the trigger. Everything can be installed just by moving the back cover of the controller. To do this installation, you will need a few things. A Phillips PH00 size screwdriver to open the controller and remove one of the screws on the trigger mount. And you will also probably want to have a pair of needle nose pliers or some tweezers, and either a pair of wire cutters or a pocket knife, because we have to trim a few little pieces of plastic. What these triggers do is not only change how the triggers feel, but also reduce the distance that the trigger needs to be pulled. So this is the Smart Trigger installed, the mouse click version. As you can see, we only have to pull the trigger around 2 millimeters to get that click. And on this side we have the silent version. Before we get into this installation, there is one thing you need to do with your controller on your PS5, and that is to disable the adaptive triggers. The adaptive trigger mechanism will not only not work with the smart triggers installed, it can interfere with the mount, causing it to push out of place, and in that instance you would have to open your controller back up to realign the mount. To do that, we need to start on your PS5 home screen, and we are going to go to the settings, console settings in the upper right corner, and from there we will go to the accessories, and from accessories we will go to controllers, and in controllers we will go to trigger effects intensity, and we want to turn that off. So this is per controller, so you need to do this with the controller you plan to install the smart triggers into. If you have other controllers that you're also installing smart triggers into, you have to do this for each controller. There is also a way I will show once we get into the controller that we can permanently disable the adaptive triggers, and that is to cut the power wires that are going to the motor. So I will show that once we get into the controller. So let's go ahead and move this off to the side, and we can start to get into this controller. And we can get to work. First thing we need to do is remove this black trim piece, which you can do with your fingernail or a small pry tool. It really just works pretty easy just to get underneath those with a fingernail and pop it forward. And then just kind of work your way up. It's just a bunch of clips, no screws yet. And we can set that out of the way. So we have 2 screws on the bottom here, and our other screws are actually underneath R1 and L1, so we have to pop those out. So again, you can use a pry tool or a pair of tweezers, just something to get behind the button there and just pop it forward. So with those removed, we can see the other 2 screws. And you will need a Phillips PH00 size screwdriver to remove all the screws. Go ahead and pull all 4 of these out. Okay, with our screws removed, we can move on to the inside of the controller. We just need to start to take this apart. We kind of need to hold it just a little bit, and there's two clips right here that we need to pop off. Once we do that, then the back of this shell will come off and we can set that aside. Now that we have our controller open, we can proceed with our installation. We need to remove the battery just so we have easier access to the triggers. And we need to make a small modification to the actual trigger before we can do the installation. And also we want to take, there's a small arm right here. This is what the adaptive trigger is using to push on the trigger with. That usually is just sticking out a little bit, and we want to take and just kind of push that down into the housing there. So we'll do that on both sides. And then what we need to do is there is a small tab, you can see that there on the back side of the trigger, and we need to cut that off. We need the whole back of the trigger to be flush, and that can be done with a knife, a pair of side cutters. Just need to make sure that it's flush. There's no extra plastic or bumps there, so we can just take a knife and just trim that off so it's nice and flat. Now there are two versions of controllers out now. This one that we are working with here is the original version, which is a BDM-010 model, and there is a BDM-020, and this is a trigger out of one of those controllers. So it also has that small tab on the back, but there are also two bumps on the outer edge of the trigger up here. It's probably kind of hard to see in this video, but they just protrude just a little bit, and that will actually cause issues with the smart trigger, so we need to either trim those two small bumps off or sand them down. Once we have that done, the next step is going to be to unplug the original trigger cable. So we just grab that and pull it out, and then remove the screw that was behind that into the adaptive trigger. Now we can take our smart trigger and our mount. This trigger just slides under this edge here, fits right into that opening, and then pushes down on this side. So that's ready to go there. Now we need to take and plug in the original flex into the plug on the smart trigger mod. So I'm just using my needle nose pliers to do that. Try and get this so you guys can see it. I'll just hold that original flex with my pliers and get it in the socket. All right, so now we have that plugged in, and now we will put the trigger in place. The screw goes back in with the mount. All right, then we can test that our button is pushing correctly, and go ahead. We'll slide this bottom part of the mod here just back along the edge and plug in the Smart Trigger mod to the original plug. All right, and that will just sit back behind there. So we're all done with one side, and we just need to complete the other side and put the controller back together. All right, we now have both sides installed. So there is the right side, and the left side we already did. And as I mentioned, if you want to permanently disable the adaptive triggers, we can cut the wires to the motors. So these skinny wires are actually for the main rumble motors. That's not what we're after. You can see down in here, there's a red and black wire down with the adaptive trigger. So that's going to the motor that pushes that little arm out. So if we just take and cut those wires, that will permanently disable those. You can also desolder them from the board, but that will take removing the trigger module, which is a lot more work. So we can see the same thing on the other side. They're kind of down in there, but it's those wires back in there. So again, just have to cut those. You only really need to cut one of them, and it will permanently stop those triggers from working. So now both triggers are installed and working, and we just have to put the controller back together. All right, battery back in. Can grab the back of our shell. Everything's back together. Just test our triggers, make sure it's working before we put our screws in. All right, all the screws are in. We can put our bumpers back on. They just snap on. And the last piece is the faceplate. That just slides in those two triangle shaped openings and snaps back on. That's it, all done. These are available on our website, consolecustoms.com, and soon on eBay and Amazon. If you have any questions, just drop us a line. Thank you.